Hello everyone, Clack of the Geek here, and welcome back to another one of these kind of debatey videos. I love doing these ones, where I'll pose a question, I will give all my thoughts on that, give my opinions, give different points and whatnot, and it always starts some really cool debates in the comments. Whether it's the most underrated Doctor video or the politics in Doctor Who video, these kind of videos I love doing, and I love your debates in the comments because you always bring up some really good points. So I want to continue doing them. And today I'm doing one about Doctor Who being dark, because this is always something that tends to get brought up. Whether people will criticise the show for being too dark, or people will criticise the show for being not dark enough. It's a really interesting sort of topic of conversation, and I just want to bring it up, give my views on it. So, chin up, let's get into it. Back in 1963, when Sidney Newman first envisioned Doctor Who, he envisioned it as a children's show to educate kids about history and science, where you'd have a time traveller, the Doctor, taking modern-day people of the time, that being Ian and Barbara, around time and space, and that's where the educational side of it would come into it, and they wanted to use real science and real history, and you have elements of that still, but it's evolved more. It's more focused on the sci-fi and the adventure, and it has changed over time. But the core of it is still very much there. But even in those early days, the Daleks. They are what got Doctor Who going properly. I would say, Dalek mania in the 60s, and there's always the stereotype that kids would hide behind the sofa whenever the monsters showed up. Maybe not certain monsters, but for the most part, that fear factor really did make Doctor Who what it was. And, it could be scary, couldn't it? And as time went on, it evolved, it went in different paths, and, so by the time you got to the John Pertwee era, it was not necessarily dark, but more mature, even though you could have dark episodes like Inferno. And now we move to one of the most iconic eras of Doctor Who, the Tom Baker era, more specifically the Philip Hinchcliffe era, which was seasons 12, 13 and 14. Some of the most iconic Doctor Who stories are in this era, but the tone was quite dark, the tone was very gothic, it was very Hammer horror-esque, stories like The Brain of Morbius took inspiration from Frankenstein, just as an example. You'd have very scary monsters like Sutekh, or the Zygons, or the Crinoids, or the Vok robots, or the Master, and whatnot. Certain characters would meet very grisly deaths, and there'd be quite creepy stuff in those episodes. This did eventually catch the attention of people like Mary Whitehouse, who would complain that Doctor Who was too violent and too creepy, but this era is fondly remembered still. It's got some of the highest viewing figures in Doctor Who history, and it's just one of the most loved eras of the show. And that horror tone, I think this is that era that really did encapsulate the stereotype that people would hide behind the sofa just as much as the Daleks did back in the 60s. I think the most controversial instance of this in Classic Who is with Colin Baker's first season, and specifically Attack of the Cybermen, which often gets cited as, these sort of violent things in Doctor Who. This story, you've got Cybermen crushing guns in half, people getting brutally murdered by them, but the one instance that people often discuss is with the scene. It's near the end of the story, and Listen is captured by the Cybermen. He's not giving them the information they want, so what they do, they crush his hands until his bones crack and fingers bleed. Now, granted, Doctor Who doesn't normally do this, and, say they went a bit further and they had Litton's hands exploding into bits and flesh and blood and whatnot. Yeah, that would be too far. But how it is in the episode, I don't personally think it's too far for Doctor Who. Yeah, yes, there's blood, and it's not sort of hidden, but it's there for a reason. It's there to show that the Cybermen are a threat, that they are a force to be reckoned with, and that they're dangerous. And keep in mind, this was the first Doctor Who story that I ever watched, and I loved it. I loved Colin Baker in it, and it cemented the Cybermen as my favourite Doctor Who film because they felt dangerous, and you know, at that point, I hadn't really watched horror films because at that age, you weren't, I wasn't really allowed to. So, you know, something like this was, you know, it was sort of a glimpse into that kind of, you know, horror sort of thing. And I loved it. But this isn't the only instance of violence in sort of the mid-80s of Doctor Who, you know. Peter Davison's story, Resurrection of the Daleks, has a higher death count than the Terminator, the original one. You have Vengeance on Varys from Colin Baker's first season, where people fall into acid baths, as well as other pretty gnarly deaths. And Revelation of the Daleks, again from Colin Baker's first season, has dead people being mutated into Daleks, as well as other nasty moments, like Davros's hand being shot off. These are all very grim things, but you've got to remember, the universe in Doctor Who can be dangerous. As the second Doctor once said, there are some corners of the universe which have bred the most terrible things. The universe isn't all fun and games, and I admire that this era of the show really did show that. And for me, I find that acceptable to show. Then when Doctor Who came back in 2005 with ECclestone, with Series 1, I think now it can be sort of classed as a prime-time BBC One drama now, as well as a sci-fi show. And I mean, Series 1, you know, you had the Doctor off the back of the Time War, and, you know, you have this darker, more brooding, more sombre Doctor. And certain stories in Series 1, you know, Dalek has some quite intense moments, whether that be the scene in the cellar with the Doctor confronting the Dalek. Moving into the Tennant era, you had stuff like Human Nature, where whilst it was also scary, it was also mature and powerful with its sort of themes and its story. Or what about the Waters of Mars with the whole Time of Victoria stuff, as well as the Flood? But for me, the darkest Doctor Who story is Series 4's Midnight, for all of the right reasons. It's one of my favourite Doctor Who stories. It's my favourite 10th Doctor story. It's the scariest Doctor Who story for my money, probably. Either that or The Empty Child. But either way, it's definitely the darkest Doctor Who story. I mean, first of all, you've got a monster that you never see. I mean, that is terrifying in itself. But the real horror for me is with the people. You know, the Doctor, he's on this transport ship, and all the people around him, they're just normal people that you could meet in a shop or meet on the street, or, you know, they're just ordinary people. And as the situation escalates, they become more and more savage. Like, they're sort of tribalistic and animalistic and just savage, and they're gonna chuck the Doctor out the airlock. They're just turning on each other, and it results in the deaths of a few people. And that scene at the end when, you know, they're all waiting for the rescue ships to come, and they're just sitting there silently. It's so powerful. It's just it's like the worst of humanity is embodied in this lot. And I think it comes back to that sort of educating that I mentioned with, you know, the Doctor Who's beginning. You know, this episode, it sort of teaches, especially kids watching, you know, a sort of moral thing of never be like that. But the one time Doctor Who does go too far with being dark is Series 8 with Dark Water. Now, I used to like what I'm going to talk about, but over time, it doesn't sit well with me. Because whilst I personally wasn't affected by this when I watched it, I recognise that it is not... It's not appropriate, is it? So in the story, you know, Cybermen, they're converting the dead. I like that idea, but then you have the don't cremate me stuff. And then the idea that people who have died can feel their bodies, you know, in this case of cremation, they can feel their bodies being burnt. That's horrific. And the thing is, this morbid idea is purely for shock value. It doesn't mean anything at all later on in the story. It's purely for shock value, and it's unneeded. And yet, this is the one time in Doctor Who where the darkness, it goes too far. But the thing is, it's not as simple as just people can't handle dark things. It's just, you know, some of the stuff I mentioned with the Colin Baker stories earlier, you know, Revelation of the Daleks. We know that dead people will not mutate into Daleks, you know. We know that's fiction. As creepy as it is, we know that's fiction. But people cremating their loved ones, that's a real thing. That's a very real, and for a lot of people, very close to home thing. And it's quite insensitive here, and just, yeah, it goes too far. However, after this, Moffat did learn his lesson, and if he ever tackled a serious subject matter, he would always do it sensitively. Heaven Sent from Series 9 portrays grief phenomenally well. And World Enough Time is the creepiest, but one of the best depictions of the Cybermen ever. So overall, I think Doctor Who can be dark. I think it should be dark at times. And I personally love it when Doctor Who is dark, but it should never be for the sake of it. It should never be just for shock value, because that will upset your audience. It should always be there for a reason, whether that be to emphasise the threat, or, in the case of Midnight, as I mentioned, to really teach the viewers, especially younger viewers, a really important sort of moral message, and showing the consequences of what happens if you don't. So that's my views on all of it all. So hope you enjoyed this video. What are your thoughts on this? Because I'd really be interested to know. Let me know all of that in the comments. Be sure to like and subscribe. Click the little bell so you don't miss a thing. And this is Clack of the Geek, signing out.